If you've ever tried making a beat where you had to come up with your own bass line, you know how hard it can be. Today I'm going to show you guys 8 tips that you can use to come up with your own bass lines a lot easier, and in no time you'll be programming your own bass lines like I've made in the beat right here. As always guys, if you like the drums from this beat, they are available to download in the description box below for free. So starting off, I have my guitar loop that I'll play for you guys real quick. So listening to this loop, you can already get the sense that it's going to be a little bit difficult trying to add a bass line to it. There's a lot of movement going on in the loop with the guitars, and it's going to take up a lot of space in the beat, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult trying to add a bass line that complements this. So tip number 1 is to come up with the bass line before you add drums to the beat. So if you have a loop or a sample that has a lot going on in it and it already takes up a lot of room in the beat, and you plan on coming up with a bass line that's a little bit more intricate than just a typical 3-note progression, it's going to be very easy for the beat to end up sounding a little bit too busy and a little bit too congested. And this is why I recommend coming up with the bass line before you add your drums. You can be a little bit more free and expressive and try a lot more intricate ideas with your bass line if you only have the sample or loop to react to. And after the fact, you can add the drums to be a little bit more reactive and program around the bass line at that point. Otherwise, if you had a drum loop already programmed in here that had a lot of ghost kicks, a lot of snare rolls, a lot of hi-hats, all of a sudden it's going to become a lot harder to program in an intricate bass line, because now you have to worry about the balance between your bass, your drums, and your loop. Whereas if you start with a bass, you can be as free as you want, and you can at that point add in the right amount of drums and still have balance between all the elements in the beat. So tip 2 is to start with the basic melody of the loop and just play along with it. So what you need to do is listen to the loop and follow along to the overall changes in direction in the underlying melody. For example, this loop sounds like it has a lot going on, but when I isolate the underlying melody, you can hear it's actually pretty basic. What I'd recommend is just breaking down the most basic part of your loop and just adding an equally basic bass line. Tip number 3 is something that I like to do to bring a little bit more cohesion to the bass line, which is to try to always bring your bass line back to the root note. So this bass line here has a simple 2-note progression, so what I'm going to do is add an extra note here in between just to try to get the overall direction back to the original root note. So once you have the basic elements of your bass line here, tip number 4 is to figure out what other notes can work with this bass line. If you know your music theory, you probably don't need to do this exercise, but for those that don't, what I like to do is just open up another plugin here and just play along with different keys to figure out what works and what doesn't, and later on I'm going to be using those same notes in the fills that I include later on in the bass line. So to me, it sounds like there are a few notes that will work well with this bass line. A sounds like it fits in, G, F, E. So these are the different notes I'm going to use later on once I start being a little bit more intricate with my bass line and I start adding fills and these additional riffs. So once we know which notes are going to work with the bass line and the loop that we've created, now we can move on to the next step. Tip number 5 is to go in and duplicate the bass plugin that you already have and start playing notes an octave or 2 higher. This is how you get those bass notes that sit on top of the heavy bass tones but still cut through to add another layer on top of your beat. So tip 6 is about how to actually program these notes in, and this is where I find a lot of producers have a difficult time figuring out which parts of the loop, which parts of the bass line they should start adding these additional notes in. What you really need to consider for this part is the idea of space and movement. What I mean by this is that you need to pick and choose the right spots in the beat to start adding your additional notes and your fills. So for example, if we look at the first bar here, the guitar is taking up a lot of room in the beat because how much movement is happening with it. There's just a lot of notes being played in this short amount of space. So if we try to shove in a bunch of bass notes in this section, it's going to be very easy for us to end up congesting the beat and making it sound a little bit too busy. But if we listen to a later section in this beat right here, we can hear that the same note is being played over and over again. Melodically, it's not very complicated, and in terms of overall movement in this short amount of space, there's just not much going on. So this would be a perfect part of the beat where we can start adding additional notes and fills. As well, at the end of the second bar here, we have a section at the back which also has a little bit less movement going on. So this is another great area where we can start adding some additional notes. So this is typically what you want to think about, picking and choosing the right spaces where there's a little bit less movement in the sample and going in and adding your own notes. This is crucial because if you choose the wrong spaces and the parts that have a lot of movement going on, it's going to be very easy for you to just clog up your beat and have it sound like a complete mess. Tip number 7 is to help make your bass line feel a little bit more natural by using glides. This is a great way to help your bass line feel a bit more natural, as if it's actually being played by a real person. So to do this, you go into your plugin. All the plugins should have this type of feature where you can go into the polyphony section here. You want to set the max to 1 and turn on the portamento and the mono function. And also there should be a slide function somewhere. You can start playing around with this dial in order to change the overall timing of the slides. So this is how it sounds with portamento turned off. Sounds very robotic and not very natural, but if I were to turn it on, this is how it sounds. It just sounds a lot more human, like it's actually being played by a real person. Tip number 8 is to play around with the velocity. Typically, I find that increasing the slide note, the one that plays after the initial one, will help just bring an overall more natural feel to the beat. This is how it sounds if I didn't do it. And with the velocity played around with a little bit, it just sounds like it's a harder emphasis on that second note, which just mimics a technique that an actual bass player would actually use. Also, going in and adjusting the velocity of all your other bass notes as well is also another good thing that you should be doing in order to keep a live feel to your overall bass line. So when I go in now and I program all of my other sounds around the bass line, I can ensure that there's not going to be too much going on in a certain space in the beat and just achieve an overall balance that's going to help the bass line feel a lot more natural and just have the beat feel a lot more cohesive. As you can see, I didn't get too elaborate with the kicks. There's just not too much going on. I didn't want to overwhelm the beat and add a bunch of crazy snare rolls or anything, just so there is just a lot more balance in the beat. So with these 8 tips, hopefully you've learned some of the key best practices when it comes to creating bass lines for your beats. Obviously, this is something that's going to require some practice on your end and some experimentation in terms of figuring out when and where you should be adding all of your additional notes and how to play along with the basic melody of your loop. But with these tips to help guide you, I am confident that you'll be making better bass lines sooner than later. As always, guys, if you found this video helpful, please do like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you find that you've had troubles with creating bass lines. Let me know if these tips have helped you. And once again, if you want to download the free drum kit, it is in the description box below. And I'll see you guys next Tuesday.